The revolution's over. Now what? The process of making new rules was crucial to the revolutionary struggle. Many scholars think it's the most distinctive and most important aspect of our revolution. Making new rules and new organizations of government actually began very early in our resistance movement. In fact, the development of these new political organizations preceded the Revolutionary War and played a central role in making the revolution happen when and how it did. New groups like the Sons of Liberty, the Stamp Act Congress, the Continental Correspondence will all share information about the resistance movement and help create the essence of what will happen after the revolution. How are we going to come together and determine this new form of government? Now, the revolution is over. Got to figure out a way to govern ourselves. First of all, no longer is the colonies governed by the crown or any colonial charter. These United States now are independent, and Americans could seek to eliminate or maintain laws any way they saw fit. So they're not bound by British law. Republican revolutionary sentiment brought significant change during the immediate post-war years. Laws regarding land holding would change. English law actually required land to be passed down in its entirety from father to eldest son. This practice is known as primogeniture, meaning that it kept large estates within the family. So the eldest son would get all of it. Well, with this new change and this new form of government, we see this law go away. Within 15 years of the revolution, not a single state had one of these primogeniture laws on the books. Huge estates of loyalists, though, were divided into smaller units. Loyalists were people that supported the crown during the American Revolution here in the colonies. Something that also changes is religion, a fight for separation of church and state. Remember, the official religion is the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, prior to the Revolution. Now with the Revolution completed, do you believe the colonists wanted to be part of the Church of England, or the Anglican Church? That is not the case. In Virginia, it hardly seemed appropriate to support the Anglican Church of England with tax dollars. The Anglican Church itself actually broke away from its English hierarchy and renamed itself the Episcopalian Church. Soon they were appointing their own American clergy. The Revolution had sparked great changes indeed. We've talked about a few: British law, landholding, and religion. How do you make the rules? That's very important. The process of making new rules is crucial to the success of our country after the Revolutionary War. Each colony, now a state, faced serious and complicated questions about how to make their rules. State constitutions. What did it mean to replace royal authority with institutions based on popular rule? How was popular sovereignty, the idea that people were the highest authority, going to be institutionalized in new state governments? For that matter, who were the people? Every state chose to answer these questions in different ways based on distinctive local experiences. In most cases, colonial traditions were continued, but modified. So, still kept with traditions that were going on prior to the revolution, but modified so that the governor of the state, the executive, actually lost a lot of power. People were very leery of any one person having so much power. So the governor, the executive in the state, loses a lot of power post-revolution. Assemblies, the legislative branch, which represents the people most directly, became much more important. Pennsylvania will create one of the most radical state constitutions of this period. Following the idea of popular rule to its logical conclusion, Pennsylvania creates a state government with several distinctive features. First of all, Pennsylvania will abolish property requirements for voting as well as for holding office. While other states would require people to own property to vote or to become an elected official, Pennsylvania does away with this. If you were an adult man who paid taxes, then you were allowed to vote or even to run for office. This is a dramatic expansion of who is considered a political person. But other aspects of their government, the Pennsylvania state government, were even more radical. Pennsylvania also became unicameral, a government where the legislature only had one body. Think of uni, like a unicycle, one wheel. Unicameral is only one body in the legislature. The governor is completely eliminated in Pennsylvania at this time. Radicals in Pennsylvania observed that the governor was really just the small-scale king of the upper legislative body, and they wanted nothing to do with the idea of any sort of king. So they got rid of the governor. The Pennsylvania Constitution decided that the people could rule most effectively through a single body with complete power. Now, South Carolina's state constitution creates a new rules kind of at the opposite end of the political spectrum from Pennsylvania. In South Carolina, white men had to possess a significant amount of property to vote, and they had to own even more property to be allowed to run for political office. In fact, these property requirements are so high that 90% of all white adults were prevented from running for political office. The thinking is that only the smartest should be running for office, and the smartest should be voting. And if you owned a lot of property, therefore you had to have some knowledge. You had to be fairly intelligent, was the thinking. So you should be the ones to vote. If you didn't own any property or have a lot of property, you should not be involved in government because evidently you're not smart enough to vote or to run for office. I don't agree with that, but this is the thinking of South Carolina's Constitution. Massachusetts, of course, always the odd bird. Their state constitution offered yet another way to answer the questions about the role of the people in creating a Republican government. When the state legislature presented the voters with a proposed constitution, it actually is rejected because the people thought that it was too important an issue for the government to present to the people. If the government could make its own rules, then it could change them whenever it wanted and easily take away people's liberties. So following through on this logic, Massachusetts held a special convention where specifically elected representatives met to decide on the best framework for a new government. So they don't even want the government presenting them with options. They want the people directly involved in deciding the framework of the new government. While these state constitutions I've talked about are being created, the Continental Congress continued to meet as a general political body. If you remember, the Continental Congress is gentlemen from each colony at the time coming together regarding the grievances against the king and the crown. Well, they still meet after the Revolution. And despite being the central government of our new nation, it does not have a lot of power. It's actually just a loose confederation of states. By 1777, members of Congress realized that they should have some clearly written rules for how they were organized. And as a result, the Articles of Confederation are drafted and passed by the Congress in November of that year. This first national constitution, I want you to remember that, the first national constitution for the United States is the Articles of Confederation. It's not really innovative, and it mostly put into written form how Congress had operated since 1775. Even though the articles were very modest in their proposals, they would still need to be ratified by all the states, and this doesn't happen for a couple of years, not until 1781. Even this accomplishment largely is accomplished because the states now are fearful of another war, and they do realize they need to cooperate. So the takeaway, I want you to remember this, is the first national constitution is the Articles of Confederation. The purpose of the central government was clearly stated in these articles. The Congress had control over diplomacy, printing money, resolving controversies between different states, and most importantly, coordinating any war effort. The most important action of the Continental Congress was probably the creation and maintenance of the Continental Army. But even in this area, the central government's power was quite limited. While Congress could call on states to contribute specific resources and numbers of men for the army, it was not allowed to force states to obey the central government's request for aid. So the Continental Congress and the articles say the government can request that the state of Pennsylvania send us so many men and so much money for the military. Pennsylvania does not have to reply. There's no teeth to this articles. Now, the organization of Congress itself demonstrates the primacy of state power. Under the Articles of Confederation, each state had one vote. 9 out of 13 states had to support a law for it to be enacted. Furthermore, any changes to the articles themselves would require unanimous agreement. In the one state, one vote rule, state sovereignty was given a primary place even within the national government. Furthermore, the whole national government consisted entirely of a unicameral body. Remember, unicameral, one body of Congress, with no executive and no judicial organizations. The National Congress's limited power was especially clear when it came to money issues. Not surprisingly, given that the revolution's cause had centered on opposition to unfair taxes, the central government had no power to raise its own revenues through taxation. All it could do was request that the states give it the money necessary to run the government and wage any war. By 1780, with the outcome of the war still very much undecided, the government had run out of money and was actually bankrupt. As a result, the paper money it issued was basically worthless. The Constitutional Convention. Representation remained the core issue of the Philadelphia Convention. The same old question arises: what is the best way for authority to be delegated from the people in the states to a strengthened government? Delegates from all throughout the states come together to try to determine how to do this best. What is the best way for authority to be delegated from the people in the states to a strengthened central government? To take into consideration the big states and the small states. And what we'll have here is actually a compromise, known as the Connecticut Compromise. They'll suggest that representatives in each house of a proposed bicameral legislature be selected through different means. Now, we've talked about unicameral, one body. What we're proposing, or what they proposed, is a bicameral, meaning two houses, two bodies in the legislature, which you hopefully know the United States has. We have the Congress and the Senate, a bicameral legislature. Now, these two houses, this bicameral legislature, consist of the upper house, which we would know as the Senate. The Senate would reflect the importance of state sovereignty by including two people from each state, regardless of size. So the upper house had two representatives, no matter how big or how small your state is. Meanwhile, the lower house, or the House of Representatives, would have a different number of representatives from each state based on the population. So bigger states would have more congresspeople, at the time congressmen, because they were the only ones allowed to be in this. So the Senate, everyone is equal, there's two per state, and the lower house, the House of Representatives, the number of representatives is determined by the size of your population. This is a compromise. It's actually a victory for small states because they are on equal footing in the Senate, which is needed through any sort of legislation. Now, we kind of have the rules here, but we need to determine who could vote, who can be part of this. As we mentioned, different state constitutions had created different rules about how much property was required for white men to vote. The delegates needed to figure out a solution that could easily satisfy people with many different ideas about the role of voting and who could vote. For that popular lower house, the Congress, which I mentioned, any white man who paid taxes could vote. Even those without property could vote for who would represent them in the House of Representatives, the Congress. To balance this opening, the senators in the upper house, the Senate, of the national government would be elected by state legislatures. This is different now. Students, I just want to make sure you're aware of that. We don't do this anymore. Now you vote for your senators. But initially, state legislatures determined and voted on the senators. Now the president, that is the executive branch, would be elected at the state level through an electoral college. whose numbers reflected representation in the legislature. This is a hot button issue on the president, but even today, the president is voted on and deemed by the Electoral College. Now, we need to get into the horrific institution of slavery because while I haven't mentioned it in depth prior to this, slavery is an integral part of American history. And it's going to take front and center to myself when we deal with the Constitution and our beginnings. Now, slavery, some delegates did consider at our Constitutional Convention slavery an evil institution. In fact, George Mason of Virginia even suggested that the transatlantic slave trade be made illegal by these new national rules that they were coming up with. Of course, delegates from South Carolina and Georgia, where slavery was expanding rapidly, opposed this limitation. If any limitations to slavery were proposed in this national framework that they were trying to work out, this Constitution, these gentlemen from South Carolina and Georgia and several others would immediately threaten to leave and oppose any form of new plan for a stronger government. This fierce opposition allowed no room for compromise, and as a result, the issue of slavery was treated as merely political rather than a moral question. Delegates agreed that a strengthened union of the states was more important than the revolutionary ideal of equality, that they could not deal with slavery at this point if they wanted to get the Constitution and this document created. This is pragmatic, but tragic at the same time. This constitutional compromise regarding slavery and the slave trade is one of the darker days in this country's history. Now, the slave trade was always a controversial issue. The proposed Constitution actually strengthened the power of slave states in several important respects. The Fugitive Clause, for example, governments of free states were required to help recapture runaway slaves who had escaped their master states. In addition, the 3/5 formula established the determination of representation in the lower house of the legislature. Slave states wanted to make sure to include their slave population when determining the number of representatives they would have. Very hypocritical. It's just very hypocritical that the slave states, while not thinking of slaves as human beings, will try to use them and say they are when it comes to us getting representatives in Congress. It all boils down to slave states wanted to have additional political power based on the number of human beings that they held as slaves. Now, delegates from free states wouldn't allow such a blatant manipulation of political principles, but the inhumane compromise that resulted meant counting slave persons as 3/5 of a free person for the sake of calculating the number of people a state could elect to a House of Representatives. Let me simplify that just to make sure I'm stressing this, that it took every slave was not a full person. They were 3/5 of a person when determining the number of representatives. That unto itself is a horrific, morally questionable compromise. But it was made for the sake of the Constitution. After the difficult debate in Philadelphia from May to September of 1787, the delegates had actually fashioned out new rules for a stronger central government that extended national power well beyond the scope of those Articles of Confederation I mentioned earlier. The Constitution created a national legislature this national legislature could pass the supreme law of the land, could raise taxes, and with greater control over commerce, meaning business. It could also restrict state actions, especially in regard to passing pro-debtor laws. Pro-debtor laws are when states would print more money on their own. States would print money so that people that were in debt could more easily pay off their loans. Of course, this would be detrimental to the country as a whole, having more money out there when the only people that are printing money, are supposed to be printing money, is the United States of America. At the end of this long process of creating this new plan, 38 of the remaining 41 delegates showed their support by signing the proposed Constitution. This small group of national superstars had created a major new framework through hard work and compromise. This Constitution, which is used as a beacon for around the world as a guiding principle. Now, it does have the possibility and the mechanisms to be amended, and like I mentioned, this is a unique document. Now, it needs to be ratified by all the states for it to go into effect. So it's time for ratification. We do have people that strongly support this Constitution. These supporters of the Constitution are known as Federalists. The supporters of this Constitution were aware that the problems of the country stem from the weakness of a central government created by those Articles of Confederation. Most leaders of the era were Federalists. Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, two of the most famous. The Federalists are well organized, they're well funded, and they made especially careful use of the printed word, meaning they would print out articles and essays on why every state needs to ratify this Constitution. And in fact, most these essays are known as the Federalist Papers, which you may have been required to read in high school, if I remember correctly. In fact, most newspapers supported the Federalist political plan and published articles and pamphlets in support of approval of the Constitution. The Federalists still had a hard fight in front of them. Their solutions were a significant alteration to political beliefs in this period. Remember, states believed that they were the highest power. They knew what was best for their state, and they weren't going to want a higher authority, a central authority, deeming them wrong or overruling them. But the Federalists truly believed that the greatest threat to the future of the United States did not lie in the abuse of that central power that states are afraid of, but instead they feared that the excesses of democracy, meaning too much democracy, which I know sounds kind of, how can you have too much democracy? But they feared the common people, the common man at the state level, and truly believed that we needed a strong central government, these Federalists. First of all, the president, the highest member of the executive branch, in the Constitution, the president has a veto, and the veto could overturn decision of the people's representatives in the legislature. This was especially disturbing to anti-federalists, that this president can veto any legislature from the from the representatives. So this was kind of one of those things that anti-federalists really did not like. The federal court system. This court system of the national government would more than likely encroach on local courts. Anti-federalists, people that are more onto the states' rights, would argue, you mean that my court, I can take something to my state court, and this national court, this federal court, this Supreme Court can rule it unconstitutional, can rule against me, even though my state says this is correct. Anti-federalists are leery of this federal court system. And they're also not too happy with this idea of a bicameral Congress. Especially the proposed lower house of legislature would have so few members that only elites would be elected. They would represent such a large area. Could they really know their constituents, their people? The initial lower house, the 55 members of the National House of Representatives, was quite a bit smaller than most state legislatures at the period. And in fact, since these new legislatures were to have the fiscal authority, meaning to tax or to raise taxes, many anti-federalists feared that before long Congress would pass oppressive taxes that they would enforce by creating a national army. Side note, most Americans, we still fear Congress and taxes, too many taxes. So this is not something new even today. But the most powerful objection raised by anti-federalists, however, hinged on the lack of protection for individual liberties in the Constitution. most of the state constitutions I've talked about had built-in explicit protection of individual rights that could not be intruded upon by the state. This kind of was seen as a safeguard of people's rights and was considered a major revolutionary improvement over the unwritten protections of the British Constitution. Why then had the delegates in the Philadelphia Convention not include a Bill of Rights in the proposed Constitution? Most Anti-Federalists thought such protections were not granted because the Federalists represented a sinister movement to roll back the gains made for ordinary people during the Revolution. This was not the case. And in fact, ratification of the Constitution is not easy. Smaller states will ratify quickly because it's in their best interest. Other states needed to be convinced. I mentioned the Federalist Papers. But back to those individual liberties. What we have here is a promise to go back and amend our Constitution. I talked about amendments, and hopefully you're all aware of the first 10 amendments to our Constitution, also known as the Bill of Rights. In this slide, I list the first 10 amendments, which are Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, to bear arms, quartering of soldiers. We don't have to, arrest and search and seizures. I'm not going to go through them all. But this agreement between Anti-Federalists and Federalists regarding the future of our nation at stake over this Constitution, the inclusion of a Bill of Rights, we actually see the Constitution finally be ratified and go forward, which is, of course, still our guiding document to this day.